A cave deep in the Iberian Peninsula, untouched for thousands of years, holds the remains of a woman from the Ice Age. Her DNA, extracted from ancient bones, carries a story written long before recorded history. A story of survival, adaptation, and an unbroken lineage stretching back nearly 19,000 years. But she wasn't alone. For millennia, the Iberian Peninsula served as a refuge, a land where different human groups converged, coexisted, and in some cases, disappeared entirely. What secrets do these ancient genes reveal? And how did a land at the edge of Europe shape the people who call it home today? Iberia's genetic story begins with the last ice age. As glaciers swallowed much of Europe, humans in the north were forced to retreat or perish. But in Iberia, the milder climate allowed them to survive. Here, two distinct genetic lineages coexisted. One came from the Magdalenian hunter-gatherers, who had lived in Western Europe for tens of thousands of years. The other, the Villabrenner group, arrived later and spread across Europe, replacing earlier populations almost everywhere, except in Iberia. Unlike the rest of the continent, where Magdalenian ancestry was nearly wiped out, Iberia remained a genetic melting pot. It was the only place where these two lineages merged, creating a unique genetic signature that would persist for thousands of years. Then, around 5700 BCE, everything changed. Farmers from Anatolia arrived, bringing agriculture and a new way of life. In most of Europe, these newcomers completely replaced the hunter-gatherers. But not in Iberia. DNA evidence shows that instead of disappearing, the local hunter-gatherers mixed with the farmers, contributing up to 20% of the genetic makeup of early Iberians. This was not a simple conquest, but a gradual fusion of cultures and bloodlines. For centuries, Iberia remained a land of coexistence, but new forces were on the horizon. The Bronze Age brought an upheaval so drastic that it reshaped the genetic fabric of the region. Nearly 40% of Iberia's ancestry was suddenly replaced, and more shockingly, almost all local Y chromosome lineages disappeared. In their place, new male-dominated bloodlines from the Pontic steppe, in modern-day Ukraine and Russia, took over. The question remains, was this a peaceful migration, or something far more violent? There's little evidence of mass warfare or destruction, yet the disappearance of local male lineages suggests a complete societal shift, one that restructured Iberian power dynamics forever. The Basques, one of Europe's most mysterious peoples, hold a key to understanding these changes. Their language, unrelated to any other in Europe, has baffled linguists for centuries. DNA shows that the Basques, too, were affected by the steppe migrations, yet their language remained untouched. How did they resist cultural assimilation when others did not? Perhaps isolation in the rugged mountains of northern Spain shielded them from later influences. Or maybe their society was structured in a way that preserved their ancient traditions against all odds. As Iberia moved into the Iron Age, new arrivals, Phoenicians, Greeks, and later the Romans, brought waves of genetic influence. But one of the most striking discoveries comes from the Muslim era. The arrival of North African and Arab peoples in 711 CE reshaped the genetic map of Iberia. By the time of the Reconquista, their influence was widespread. Yet after the expulsion of Muslims and Jews in 1492, much of this genetic legacy was erased. Today, only about 5% of Iberian DNA carries traces of this once dominant ancestry. So, what does modern Iberian DNA tell us? Despite thousands of years of migration, conquest, and cultural shifts, the core ancestry of Iberians today still traces back to the Bronze and Iron Ages. The steppe migrations left a lasting impact, but the ancient hunter-gatherer and Neolithic farmer DNA remains woven into the genetic tapestry of Spain and Portugal. The Basques remain the closest genetic link to Iron Age Iberians, untouched by later migrations. And while traces of North African ancestry linger, much of the genetic influence from the Islamic period was lost to time. The Iberian Peninsula's history is not just one of invasions and conquests. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and resilience. A story told not through ancient texts or crumbling ruins, but through the DNA that lives on in its people. The story of the Iberian Peninsula's genetic past is filled with twists and turns, civilizations rising and falling, migrations reshaping populations, and cultures blending in ways that left lasting imprints on its people. But what if we could step further back? Before the Romans, before the Phoenicians, even before the first farmers set foot on this land, who were the true ancestors of the Iberians? New genetic research is revealing a side of history that no ancient text could ever capture. We now know that more than 19,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in Iberia carried genetic lineages that were unique compared to the rest of Europe. These people were not isolated. They were part of a network of ancient populations, but they remained distinct. While other parts of the continent saw major population replacements, Iberia held onto its genetic diversity, a pattern that would continue throughout its history. Then came the first farmers, arriving around 5,700 BCE, bringing a way of life that transformed the landscape. But they didn't just bring agriculture. They also carried new genes. Unlike other regions where hunter-gatherers were almost entirely replaced, Iberia's genetic blueprint remained mixed. The farmers contributed the majority of the ancestry, but the hunter-gatherers left a mark that would persist for generations. But something unusual was happening in Iberia compared to the rest of Europe. While other parts of the continent experienced major genetic turnovers during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, Iberia followed a different path. DNA studies show that the genetic makeup of Iberians remained surprisingly stable through these periods, with only gradual shifts rather than sudden replacements. This suggests a different kind of interaction between old and new populations, one where local traditions and lineages endured rather than being erased. Yet, a seismic change was on the horizon. Around 2500 BCE, a new wave of people arrived, the descendants of steppe pastoralists who had swept across Europe. In most of the continent, these migrations led to massive genetic turnovers. In Iberia, the impact was significant but still followed a unique pattern. Instead of an immediate and complete replacement, there was a gradual mixing. However, one aspect stands out. Almost all Y chromosome lineages from earlier Iberians disappeared, replaced by those of the newcomers. This wasn't just a shift in population. It was a restructuring of society itself. But while these steppe migrations shaped the genetic foundation of Iberia, they didn't dictate its cultural identity. The Basques, for example, retained their ancient language despite sharing genetic ties with other Iberians affected by these migrations. This challenges the idea that genetics alone determines culture. Sometimes, geography, isolation, and social structures play a bigger role in preserving traditions. As the centuries passed, Iberia continued to absorb new influences, from the Mediterranean trade routes that brought in Phoenicians and Greeks to the vast reach of the Roman Empire. Yet, despite these external influences, Iberia's core genetic identity remained rooted in its ancient past. Even the arrival of the Moors in 711 CE left only a partial genetic footprint, which was later diminished through centuries of reconquista. Today, the Iberian Peninsula's people still carry the echoes of these ancient populations. Their DNA holds traces of the first hunter-gatherers, the pioneering farmers, the Bronze Age migrations, and the many civilizations that followed. But through all these changes, one thing remains clear. Iberia's history is not one of total replacement but of deep continuity. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula has been a land of constant movement, a gateway between continents, a meeting point of civilizations, and a battleground for competing cultures. But before the grand cities of the Romans or the mighty fortresses of the Moors, Iberia was already undergoing a transformation, one that would forever shape its people at the genetic level. By around 3000 BCE, Iberia was a land of thriving communities, connected through trade routes stretching far beyond its borders. But something was different here compared to the rest of Europe. While Central and Northern Europe saw dramatic shifts in ancestry due to large-scale migrations, Iberia followed a slower, more complex pattern of change. The DNA from individuals in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age reveals an unusual continuity. Hunter-gatherer ancestry had not been erased, but was instead woven into the genetic fabric of the people. However, this era was not one of complete stability. The arrival of the so-called beaker phenomenon, marked by distinctive pottery, advanced metallurgy, and new burial customs, brought significant cultural shifts. Yet, when geneticists examined the remains of beaker individuals in Iberia, they discovered something surprising. Unlike their counterparts in Central Europe, who carried a high percentage of steppe ancestry, the Iberian beaker people showed little genetic change. This suggests that the spread of the beaker culture in Iberia was driven more by the exchange of ideas and traditions rather than large-scale migration. That would change in the centuries that followed. Around 2500 BCE, a new wave of genetic influence began arriving, this time from the eastern steppes of Europe. These steppe-descended individuals carried a genetic signature that would soon become dominant in much of Western Europe. In Iberia, however, the impact was once again unique. While the genetic landscape shifted significantly, it didn't happen overnight. It took centuries for steppe ancestry to spread, blending with the local populations rather than completely replacing them. One of the most striking changes during this period wasn't just genetic, it was social. The Y chromosome evidence tells a dramatic story. Almost all earlier male lineages disappeared, replaced by those of the incoming steppe populations. This suggests a restructuring of power, where new male elites took control, possibly integrating with existing societies rather than conquering them outright. But while male ancestry saw a near-total turnover, maternal lineages, passed from mother to child, remained more consistent, highlighting the complexity of this transition. By the time Iberia entered the Iron Age, the genetic landscape had settled into a new balance. While Indo-European languages took hold in many parts of the continent, the Iberian Peninsula remained linguistically diverse. The Basques, for example, carried the same genetic imprint of steppe migrations, but held onto their non-Indo-European language, a rare case of genetic and linguistic divergence in European history. Through these centuries of transformation, Iberia remained distinct. The genetic shifts were real, but they were gradual, layered, and deeply tied to the land's unique geography. This wasn't a simple story of one people replacing another. It was a story of adaptation, integration, and resilience. The Iberian Peninsula was never an isolated land. For thousands of years, its shores and mountains bore witness to the arrival of traders, conquerors, and travelers from distant lands. But one of the most fascinating and often overlooked chapters of its genetic history is the deep connection between Iberia and North Africa, a relationship that began long before recorded history. Evidence of contact between the two regions stretches back over 4,000 years. Archaeological findings reveal North African ivory ornaments in Iberian sites from the Copper Age, hinting at trade across the Mediterranean. But the genetic evidence tells an even deeper story, one of people, not just goods, crossing the sea. DNA from skeletons found near Madrid and Cadiz reveals individuals with clear North African ancestry as early as 2000 BCE. These were not isolated cases, but part of a broader pattern of sporadic migration and interaction. However, it wasn't until the first millennium BCE that North African ancestry became more widespread in Iberia. The arrival of the Phoenicians, who established settlements along the southern coast, introduced new cultural influences and further genetic mixing. This exchange continued under the Carthaginians, who controlled parts of Iberia before the rise of Rome. By the time the Romans took over in the 2nd century BCE, Iberia had already absorbed centuries of influence from across the Mediterranean. During the Roman period, the genetic transformation of the Iberian Peninsula accelerated. The empire's vast network connected Iberia to regions as far as the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, bringing waves of new settlers. Genetic studies show that by the time of the Roman occupation, Iberia's population had been reshaped by this continuous influx, blending with local lineages in a way that would have lasting effects. But perhaps the most significant genetic impact came with the Muslim expansion in the 8th century CE. When North African and Arab armies crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, they didn't just bring a new religion and governance, they brought a genetic imprint that would shape Iberian ancestry for centuries. Over the following 700 years of Al-Andalus, large-scale migration from North Africa further diversified the population. In some regions, up to half of the genetic makeup was linked to North African ancestry, a testament to the deep integration between the two cultures. Yet, history would take another dramatic turn. With the Christian Reconquista and the eventual expulsion of Muslim and Jewish populations in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, much of this North African genetic legacy was gradually diluted. Today, traces of these ancient connections remain detectable, particularly in southern Spain and Portugal, though at a much lower percentage than during the medieval period. Iberia's relationship with North Africa is a story of continuous exchange, adaptation, and transformation. Unlike the sudden genetic shift seen in other parts of Europe, Iberia's history was shaped by a steady blending of peoples over thousands of years. The result? A genetic tapestry as complex as its history, one that continues to fascinate researchers and challenge old assumptions about migration, identity, and cultural evolution. For thousands of years, the Iberian Peninsula has been a crossroads of civilizations, but one of the most significant turning points in its genetic history occurred during the Bronze Age. Around 2500 BCE, a new population began arriving, a people with origins from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, an expansive grassland stretching from modern-day Ukraine to western Kazakhstan. They didn't come in vast invading armies, nor did they leave behind a record of sudden conquest. Instead, they integrated over time, reshaping the very foundation of Iberian ancestry. At first, their presence was subtle. Archaeological records suggest that for a few centuries, these newcomers coexisted with the local Copper Age populations without immediate large-scale conflict. But beneath the surface, a slow transformation was taking place. Genetic studies reveal that by 2000 BCE, up to 40% of Iberia's ancestry had shifted due to this migration. The impact on the male lineage was even more dramatic. Almost 100% of the Y chromosomes of Iberian men were replaced, suggesting a complex but profound social change. Unlike in Central Europe, where steppe migrations had been associated with widespread disruptions and cultural shifts, Iberia's transition was different. The archaeological evidence does not point to mass violence or destruction of settlements. Instead, it appears that these steppe-descended groups integrated into existing societies, adopting local customs while introducing their own. One of their most significant contributions was the spread of the Indo-European languages in parts of Iberia, though not everywhere, an unusual pattern compared to the rest of Europe. One of the enduring mysteries of this period is how such a dramatic genetic transformation occurred without a clear record of violent conflict. Some researchers suggest that this may have been due to shifts in power structures, when new male elites gradually took control over Iberian societies. Others believe that the newcomers introduced social systems that favored their genetic expansion over generations. Whatever the case, the result was undeniable, a fundamental shift in the genetic makeup of Iberians that would persist for millennia. As the Bronze Age progressed, the descendants of these steppe migrants became an integral part of Iberian society, blending with the local population to form the diverse genetic landscape that would define the region for centuries to come. The echoes of this migration still exist today in the DNA of modern Iberians, a hidden trace of a transformative era that reshaped the peninsula forever. The Iron Age brought another wave of transformation to the Iberian Peninsula, not just in culture and technology, but deep within its genetic code. By this time, the descendants of Bronze Age societies had established distinct civilizations, each with its own traditions, languages, and power structures. Yet, new influences were on the horizon, ones that would redefine the genetic and cultural fabric of Iberia. Between 900 and 400 BCE, an influx of people with ancestry linked to northern and central Europe began appearing in Iberia. This wasn't a single, organized migration, but rather a series of movements that, over generations, altered the population landscape. Archaeologists associate these migrations with the expansion of Celtic cultures, bringing new technologies, warfare strategies, and social structures. Interestingly, while the spread of steppe ancestry in Central and Northern Europe had been closely tied to the Indo-European language family, Iberia presented a unique case. Steppe-related ancestry increased across the region, yet not all of these areas adopted Indo-European tongues. One of the most fascinating genetic discoveries is linked to the Basques, a group that has long puzzled historians and linguists alike. Unlike their neighbors, they maintained a non-Indo-European language, Euskara, despite sharing the same genetic shifts as other Iron Age Iberians. This suggests that while migration and admixture played a role in shaping Iberia's gene pool, language and culture were shaped by other forces, such as geography, isolation, and social structures. Meanwhile, In the southern and eastern regions of Iberia, trade and contact with Mediterranean civilizations, such as the Phoenicians and Greeks, left their own subtle genetic imprints. These newcomers didn't arrive in vast numbers, but they integrated into local societies, introducing new technologies, art forms, and economic networks that connected Iberia to the wider ancient world. By the end of the Iron Age, the Iberian Peninsula had become a true genetic mosaic, an intricate blend of local continuity and external influences. The stage was now set for the next major chapter in Iberia's history, one that would see the arrival of an empire powerful enough to leave a lasting genetic and cultural legacy in Rome. The arrival of the Romans in the Iberian Peninsula was not just a political conquest, it was a complete transformation. For over 600 years, Rome reshaped the region's infrastructure, economy, language, and, most significantly, its people. But what did this mean for the genetic identity of Iberians? By the 3rd century BCE, Iberia was a battleground between Rome and Carthage, two superpowers fighting for control of the Mediterranean. When Rome emerged victorious, the peninsula was gradually absorbed into the empire. But unlike earlier migrations, where small groups mixed with local populations over centuries, Roman expansion brought something different: mass movement. Soldiers, administrators, traders, and settlers arrived from every corner of the empire: Italy, Greece, North Africa, the Levant, each carrying distinct genetic markers that would forever alter Iberia's ancestry. One of the most striking genetic signatures from this period comes from the Eastern Mediterranean. DNA analysis reveals that many individuals in Roman Iberia carried genetic traits linked to Greece, Anatolia, and even the Levant. The genetic diversity in Iberian cities skyrocketed, especially in major Roman hubs like Tarraco, Emerita Augusta, and Corduba. These were no longer just Iberian settlements. They were globalized Roman cities, where Latin was spoken in the streets, Mediterranean goods filled the markets, and people from vastly different backgrounds lived side by side. Yet, while Rome introduced a cosmopolitan element to Iberia's genetic makeup, it wasn't a one-way street. Iberians themselves became integrated into the broader Roman world. Genetic studies suggest that Iberian men, particularly those from elite or warrior classes, were recruited into Roman legions and stationed in distant provinces. Some settled in regions as far as Britannia, Gaul, and the Balkans, taking their Iberian ancestry with them and leaving traces of it in populations far beyond the peninsula. However, Rome's influence was not evenly spread. Some regions, like the Basque Country, remained genetically distinct, resisting large-scale Romanization both culturally and biologically. This isolation would play a key role in preserving their unique linguistic and genetic heritage well beyond the Roman era. As centuries passed, Rome's grip on Iberia weakened. By the 5th century CE, waves of instability and invasions from Germanic tribes signaled the empire's decline. But even after Rome itself crumbled, its genetic legacy in Iberia endured. The people of the peninsula now carried within them the echoes of one of the greatest civilizations in history, a blend of indigenous Iberian ancestry infused with Roman, Greek, and North African influences. By the early 5th century CE, Rome's once mighty empire was fracturing. The Iberian Peninsula, once a thriving Roman province, became a battlefield for new invaders, Germanic tribes that would reshape the region's genetic and cultural landscape in ways that still linger today. As Roman authority crumbled, waves of Visigoths, Suebi, Vandals, and Alans swept into Iberia. These groups were not a unified force, but separate tribes with distinct ancestries and customs. The Visigoths, originally from Scandinavia and later settled in Eastern Europe, played the most dominant role. By 418 CE, they had been granted land in Gaul by the Romans, but as the empire weakened, they set their sights on Iberia. By 507 CE, after being expelled from France by the Franks, they fully established their kingdom, ruling over much of Spain and Portugal. So, how did this impact Iberia's genetic identity? Unlike the Romans, who arrived in massive numbers and mixed widely with the locals, the Visigothic elite largely maintained their separate ruling class. DNA studies show that while there was some genetic contribution from these Northern European warriors, it was nowhere near as significant as Rome's earlier influence. The Visigoths ruled, But they didn't replace the local population. Instead, they integrated into an already diverse genetic pool. However, their presence did bring something new, a cultural shift. Unlike the Romans, the Visigoths practiced Arian Christianity, a belief system that clashed with the Catholic traditions of Iberian Romans. This religious divide influenced Iberian society for centuries. Over time, the Visigoths abandoned Arianism and embraced Catholicism, but their distinct warrior aristocracy remained in power, shaping the social and political structures of medieval Spain. Yet, their dominance was short-lived. In 711 CE, an army from North Africa, composed of Berbers and Arabs, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and defeated the Visigothic king, Roderick. This marked the beginning of a new era, one where Iberia would once again be transformed by a new wave of people, ideas, and genetic influences. In 711 CE, a new force swept into Iberia, marking one of the most significant turning points in the peninsula's history. An army led by the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, defeating the Visigothic king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. Within a few years, most of Iberia was under Muslim rule, giving rise to Al-Andalus, a civilization that would shape the region for nearly 800 years. The arrival of the Umayyads wasn't just a military conquest, it was a massive cultural and genetic transformation. The new rulers brought people from across the Islamic world, Arabs from the Middle East, Berbers from North Africa, and even influences from as far as Persia. This influx reshaped Iberia's genetic map, introducing North African and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry that remains detectable in Spanish and Portuguese populations today. Unlike previous conquests, Al-Andalus thrived on diversity. Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted in a complex society where trade, science, and architecture flourished. Cities like Córdoba and Toledo became intellectual powerhouses, preserving ancient Greek and Roman knowledge while pioneering advancements in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. But this period wasn't just about culture. Genetic studies reveal a clear impact on Iberia's population. DNA evidence shows that by the time of Muslim rule, North African ancestry had become more prominent, especially in southern regions like Andalusia and Valencia. This wasn't just from initial conquest, but due to centuries of migration, trade, and intermarriage between Berbers, Arabs, and local Iberians. However, this era of multiculturalism wouldn't last forever. In the north, Christian kingdoms were slowly reclaiming territory. Over centuries, the Reconquista pushed southward, gradually erasing Al-Andalus from the map. By 1492, the last Muslim kingdom of Granada fell, and Catholic monarchs began systematically eliminating Islamic and Jewish influences. Despite the Reconquista, the genetic legacy of Al-Andalus remained. Even today, traces of North African ancestry can be found in modern Iberians, particularly in southern Spain and Portugal. The centuries of Muslim rule left an undeniable mark, not just in architecture and language, but deep within the very DNA of the peninsula's people. By the late 15th century, Iberia was at a crossroads. The centuries-long Reconquista had ended, and with it came a dramatic shift in the region's population, culture, and even genetics. The fall of Granada in 1492 was not just a political victory for the Catholic monarchs. It marked the beginning of a forced transformation of Iberian society. Muslims and Jews, who had lived in the peninsula for centuries, were given a stark choice: convert to Christianity or leave. Many who stayed became conversos or moriscos, blending into the Christian population but retaining traces of their original ancestry. The Spanish and Portuguese empires were expanding across the Atlantic, bringing new genetic influences into Iberia. Ships returning from the Americas carried not only gold and silver, but also people, enslaved Africans, indigenous individuals from the New World, and even settlers of mixed descent. Over the next few centuries, this transatlantic movement subtly reshaped the genetic landscape, introducing small but measurable African and Native American ancestry into the population. At the same time, Spain and Portugal's involvement in Mediterranean trade connected them with Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and North Africa. Genetic studies show a distinct increase in Eastern Mediterranean and North African gene flow during this period, reflecting the movement of sailors, merchants, and soldiers who settled in Iberian cities. The genetic diversity of the region continued to expand, even as its rulers attempted to enforce religious and cultural homogeneity. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Spain and Portugal had begun to decline as global powers, but their genetic legacy had already been written. The forced conversions, expulsions, colonial expansions, and centuries of migration had shaped the modern Iberian genome in a way few other regions could match. Today, genetic studies reveal traces of these vast historical movements. Medieval Jewish ancestry in Spanish populations, Berber influences in southern Iberia, and even small amounts of Native American DNA in regions connected to colonial trade. In the modern era, Iberia continues to be shaped by migration. The 20th and 21st centuries brought new waves of movement, with people from Latin America, North Africa, and Eastern Europe adding yet another layer to the peninsula's complex genetic history. But despite these changes, one thing remains clear. Iberia has always been a meeting place of cultures, civilizations, and people, a land where history is written not just in books and monuments, but in the DNA of its people.